The note was not meant for him. Walter Wilcox knew that the moment he pulled the folded square of paper from the hollow of the old cedar fence post at the edge of the Sawyer property line, the paper trembling in the October wind like something alive and desperate. He knew because the fence post had been used as a message drop for years before he ever arrived in Caldwell County, Kansas, and whoever had left this note had tucked it with the kind of careful, deliberate urgency that told a man the person writing it believed their life depended on it being found by the right set of eyes. The problem was, Walter was almost certain he was the wrong set of eyes entirely. He unfolded it anyway. The handwriting was small and precise, the letters formed with the disciplined hand of a woman who had learned to write carefully because paper had always been too precious to waste on sloppy penmanship. The ink was dark and fresh, not more than a few hours old, and the words that filled that small square of paper drove the breath clean out of his chest like a fist to the sternum. If you find this before Thursday morning, please ride to Sheriff Hannigan in Wichita and tell him that Donahue has the deed and that I signed it under threat. I have no one else to ask. I cannot leave without raising suspicion. If this note never reaches anyone, then by Thursday I will be a woman married against her will to a man who has made it very clear what happens to women who refuse him. My name is Marcella Sawyer. The ranch is the Broken Spur. God willing, someone will find this who still has good in them. Walter stood at that fence post for a long moment in the dying amber light of an October afternoon, the note held between his roughened fingers, the wind pulling at the brim of his hat, his heart doing something complicated and violent inside his chest. He had ridden into Caldwell County 3 weeks ago looking for work and a temporary place to rest his bones, not to inherit someone else's desperate circumstance. He had his own dark past trailing him like a second shadow, his own reasons for keeping his head down and his name quiet. Getting involved in a woman's trouble with a man like Donahue, whoever that was the kind of thing that got a drifting ranch hand shot in a ditch somewhere between here and the Oklahoma border. And yet, he read the note a second time, and then a third. God willing, someone will find this who still has good in them. Walter Wilcox folded the note carefully, tucked it inside his coat against his chest, turned back toward the small bunkhouse at the far corner of the Keller Ranch where he had been sleeping for the past 3 weeks, saddled his roan gelding Copper in the last pale light of the day, and rode. He did not stop until the sun went fully under, and then he kept riding. To understand what Walter found when he finally arrived in Wichita at 4 in the morning, gray-faced with exhaustion and smelling of hard miles, and to understand why it sent him immediately back the other way, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day Marcella Sawyer first put pen to paper in the kitchen of the Broken Spur Ranch house, her hands shaking so badly the first attempt was illegible, and understand the full shape of the trap that had been closing around her for the better part of a year. The Broken Spur had belonged to Marcella's father, Thomas Sawyer, a man of moderate success and immoderate stubbornness, who had built the ranch up from raw Kansas prairie over 20 years of brutal, honest labor. He had raised Marcella largely alone after her mother died of cholera when Marcella was 11, and he had raised her to be competent, clear-eyed and deeply, privately fierce. She could ride before most girls her age could sew. She could read a cattle ledger before she could bake a proper biscuit. Thomas Sawyer had wanted a son to carry on his name, and had gotten a daughter who proved to be twice as capable as any son he might have raised, a fact that filled him with a pride he expressed mostly through gruffness, and occasionally through tears when he thought she wasn't watching. Thomas Sawyer had died in January of 1882, which put the whole of the Broken Spur, its 2,000 acres, its modest herd of 240 cattle, and its accumulated debt into the hands of his 26-year-old daughter. The debt was the problem. Thomas had borrowed money 2 years prior from a man named Gerald Donahue to weather a particularly devastating winter and a cattle market that had dropped so sharply It had bankrupted 3 neighboring ranches outright. Gerald Donahue was not a banker in any official sense. He was a land speculator, a bully dressed in fine wool, a man who had come to Kansas from somewhere back east with money he had made in ways he never discussed openly, and who had been systematically acquiring land in Caldwell County for 5 years through a combination of loans, coercion, and what people whispered was outright forgery. Donahue had liked Thomas Sawyer's land from the moment he first saw it. It sat on a natural water source, a clean-running creek that fed 3 other properties, and whoever owned the broken spur controlled, in practical terms, the water access for a quarter of the productive ranchland in the county. When Thomas died and Marcella inherited, Donahue had arrived at the ranch house door within 2 weeks, hat in hand, all surface gentility and barely concealed appetite. He had expressed his condolences. He had reminded her of the outstanding debt. He had suggested, with the particular brand of false helpfulness that Marcella had immediately recognized as a trap, that perhaps the simplest solution to her financial difficulties would be marriage. To him. Marcella had shown him the door with a composure that cost her approximately everything she had. Over the following 9 months, Donahue had made himself into a slow-moving catastrophe in her life. He had called the debt twice, demanding partial repayment she could not fully provide. He had spread quiet rumors about her competence, her character, her ability to manage the ranch alone. He had cultivated a relationship with the county clerk that Marcella strongly suspected involved bribery. And 3 weeks before Walter Wilcox pulled her note from that fence post, Donahue had come to the broken spur with 2 men she did not know, and a document that he claimed was the deed to the property, altered to reflect the debt she owed as being settled through land transfer. He had set a pen in front of her and told her she could sign the deed transfer or she could sign a marriage certificate. Those were her choices. He had framed it with a smile that never reached his eyes, and with the clear, cold knowledge that his 2 men were standing between her and the door. Marcella had signed nothing that night. She had managed to stall with questions about the documents, with requests to review the original loan paperwork, with every delay tactic she could manufacture from sheer desperation and raw nerve. Donahue had allowed it because he was confident. He had given her until Thursday, 4 days away at that point, telling her that was all the patience he had remaining. The moment they left, she had written the note. She had written it in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and her whole body shaking with contained fury and terror, and she had ridden to the fence post at the property line in the dark, because the fence post was known among ranchers in the county as a place where messages could be left for the mail rider, who came through every few days on his route between ranches too far apart for regular contact. She had hoped the mail rider would find it. She had not known about Walter Wilcox at all. Walter had cut across the Sawyer property line that afternoon on his way back from checking on a section of Keller's eastern fence that had been reported damaged. He had not been looking for anything. He had simply ridden within 20 feet of that cedar post and caught the white edge of the folded paper in the corner of his eye. Now let us return to Wichita, to 4 in the morning, to Walter Wilcox arriving gray-faced and urgent at the home of Sheriff Hannigan, with Marcella's note in his coat. The problem was immediate and devastating. Sheriff Hannigan was in bed with a fever that his wife described as having laid him flat for 3 days, and which would keep him flat for at least 3 more. His deputy, a young man named Crispin Aldous, who could not have been more than 20 years old, had been managing the office in his absence. Walter had explained the situation as clearly and rapidly as he could: the note, the deed, the forced choice, the Thursday deadline, the name Donahue. He had watched Crispin Aldous's face go through several changes, most of them unhelpful. "Donahue," Crispin said slowly. "You mean Gerald Donahue?" "I do. Gerald Donahue is a known associate of Judge Prescott in this county," Crispin said carefully. "Any official action we take against him is going to require documentation that can withstand scrutiny. A note from a woman on the property in question is not going to be sufficient for an arrest." Walter stared at him. "She wrote that she signed under threat," he said. "She named him specifically. She has witnesses, presumably in the two men who came with him. Men who work for Donahue," Crispin pointed out, "who will say exactly what Donahue tells them to say. I believe you, mister. I believe her. But I cannot ride out there and arrest Gerald Donahue on the strength of an unsigned note without evidence that will hold up in front of a judge who takes his Sunday dinners at Donahue's table." Walter put both hands flat on the desk in front of Crispin Aldous and breathed through his nose for 3 full seconds. "Then what can be done?" he asked. "If she has the original loan documents," Crispin said, "the ones with Thomas Sawyer's signature and the original terms, and if the deed Donahue produced was altered from those terms without her consent or her father's, that's forgery. That's a federal matter. I can send a telegraph to the Federal Land Office in Topeka tonight, but they will need to see the original documents, and that could take a week or more to move through proper channels." "She doesn't have a week," Walter said. "She has until Thursday morning." Crispin was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled open a desk drawer and removed a piece of paper and a pen. "I'm going to write you something official," he said. "It won't be an arrest warrant, but it will be a sworn statement from this office that we have received a complaint and that any transaction entered into regarding the Broken Spur Ranch between now and formal review of the complaint is under legal question. It won't stop Donahue if he decides to move hard, but it gives her something to show him that might slow him down." "And if it doesn't slow him down?" Walter asked. Crispin met his eyes steadily. "Then you'd better be there when it doesn't." Walter took the written statement, tucked it inside his coat alongside Marcella's note, went back to Copper, and turned the horse south toward Caldwell County. The sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge by then, a pale gray that would deepen into orange before he covered half the distance he needed to cover. He had not slept. He had not eaten since a cold biscuit at noon the day before. His back ached from the saddle and his eyes burned with tiredness, and he could feel, underneath all of it, a hot, clean wire of purpose running through him that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with those words. God willing, someone will find this who still has good in them. He did not know Marcella Sawyer. He had never spoken to her. He had seen her once at a distance, riding along the far edge of her property in the early morning, a small straight figure on a bay horse that moved like it trusted her completely. He had registered her the way you register any person riding confidently on their own land, as a fact of the landscape, nothing more. But her words were inside his coat, pressed against his chest, and they had rearranged something in him that had been sitting crooked for a long time. He reached the Broken Spur at 9:30 in the morning, when the sun was up and throwing long gold light across the flat Kansas grassland, and the ranch house sat low and square against the horizon with smoke coming from the chimney in thin blue ribbons. He slowed Copper to a walk at the gate and looked at the property with new eyes, seeing what Donahue saw: the creek line, the water rights, the position of the land relative to the surrounding ranches. He could feel the shape of the greed from where he sat. He rode up to the front of the house and stepped down from the saddle and knocked on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. Movement inside. A shadow behind the small window glass beside the door. Then silence. "My name is Walter Wilcox," he said to the door to whoever was listening behind it. "I work the Keller Ranch. I found your note in the fence post yesterday evening. I rode to Wichita last night. I have something from the sheriff's office for you." The silence stretched for another moment that felt much longer than it was. Then the door opened. Marcella Sawyer looked at him from the doorway with eyes that were red-rimmed from sleeplessness and recent tears, but sharp as cut glass, taking in every detail of him with an assessment so rapid and comprehensive that it nearly made him step back. She was not as small as she had seemed at a distance. She was of medium height and lean, dressed in a practical dark skirt and a cream-colored blouse that had seen hard use, her dark hair pinned back with 2 or 3 wisps escaping around her face. She held herself with the particular straightness of a person who had been working very hard not to appear frightened. She did not speak. She simply waited. "You don't know me," Walter said. I understand that. I'm not asking you to trust me on sight. But I rode through the night on the strength of what you wrote, and I think you should see what I brought back." He held out the deputy's written statement. She looked at it without taking it for a moment, her eyes moving from the paper to his face and back. Then she took it and read it, standing in the doorway with the morning light falling across her face. He watched her read it. He watched her jaw tighten, and then the tight set of it shift into something more complicated, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. "They cannot move quickly enough," she said quietly. "He is coming Thursday." "I know," Walter said. "Deputy told me. He also told me that if you have the original loan documents, the ones with your father's terms and his signature, it could establish the forgery. Do you have them?" She looked at him with those sharp, exhausted eyes. "Come inside," she said. He tied Copper to the porch rail and followed her into the ranch house. It was a modest interior, well kept in the way that spoke of careful maintenance rather than comfort. A wide kitchen and front room combined. A stone fireplace with a low fire. A table with a single chair pushed back as though she had risen from it quickly when he knocked. There were papers spread across the table, many papers, and he could see from where he stood that she had been going through them. "I have been looking for the original loan agreement since he brought that deed," she said, moving to the table. "My father was not organized. He kept things in various places, and some of them have not been found since he passed." She gestured at the papers without quite the despair he might have expected. It was more like controlled frustration. "I found the letter Donahue wrote to my father when the loan was first proposed. I found 2 of my father's ledger books. I have not found the actual signed agreement." "Where did your father keep important documents generally?" Walter asked. She looked at him again with that assessing look. "You're asking questions like you intend to help me find it." "I rode through the night," he said simply. "I'm not stopping here." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet. It was too early for trust, but something that acknowledged the statement and found it credible. "There is a tin box," she said. "My father called it his vault. I have not been able to locate it since he died. I thought it was lost or misplaced, but if the original loan agreement exists anywhere, it would be in there." "Any idea where he might have kept it that you haven't searched?" She pressed her fingers against her forehead, thinking. "The barn," she said at last. "He spent more time in the barn than in the house in his last years. I searched the obvious places, but there are storage areas I haven't gone through completely." "Then let's start there," Walter said. She turned to look at him again, and he could see her weighing it. The entire strange situation. A man she had never met showing up at her door the morning after she had dropped a desperate note into a fence post, and now standing in her kitchen calmly suggesting they go search her barn together. He could see that she knew she had no good options and that he was, regardless of her uncertainty about him, the best option currently available. "All right," she said. They went to the barn. Walter Wilcox had not come from a life of ease. He had grown up in Missouri, the third of 4 sons of a man who farmed hard land and drank harder, and he had left home at 17 with a bad reputation he had mostly earned, and a determination to build something cleaner somewhere else. He had spent years moving through the working edges of the frontier economy, cattle drives, fence work, breaking horses, a brief and inglorious stint trying to homestead in Nebraska that had cost him 2 years and everything he had saved, and a period in his early 20s that he thought about as little as possible, a time when he had made choices that still woke him at 2 in the morning and sat on his chest until dawn. He was 28 now. He had been working hard for the past 3 years to be, simply and consistently, a man who did what was right when it was in front of him to do. It was not a dramatic ambition. It was the only one he had left after everything else. He had not planned to get attached to a woman's crisis at a fence post in Kansas. And yet here he was, moving through her father's barn in the golden morning light, pulling aside old feed sacks and checking behind stored harnesses, because her words were still pressed against his chest, and because there was something about the way she moved through her own grief and fear, with that absolute refusal to collapse, that he found it impossible not to want to help. They worked in relative quiet for the better part of an hour. She knew the barn well, better than she had let on initially, and her search was methodical and efficient. She did not make small talk, and neither did he, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people focused on the same purpose, and there was a particular kind of intimacy in that, in sharing urgency, that was more connecting than conversation. It was Walter who found the tin box. It was behind a loose board in the small tack room at the back of the barn, pushed into a shallow space that had clearly been made deliberately. The board fitted so neatly it was barely visible. He had noticed it only because one corner of the board was fractionally proud of the surrounding planking, the kind of detail you missed unless you were looking very carefully, or unless you ran your hand along the wall the way he had been doing. He pulled the board free and reached into the space, and his fingers closed on cold metal. "Miss Sawyer," he said. She came to the doorway of the tack room and saw what he was holding and went very still. Then she crossed the room in 3 steps and took the box from him with both hands, holding it the way you hold something that contains something irreplaceable. Her hands were shaking. She set it on the workbench and opened it with a small key that was, remarkably, still on a hook above the workbench, as though Thomas Sawyer had always known where to find it. Inside the tin box were documents folded into neat squares, a few letters, 2 deeds to smaller parcels of land that had since been sold, and at the very bottom, a thick folded paper with Thomas Sawyer's signature and Gerald Donahue's on the bottom line. Marcella unfolded it carefully. She read it in silence. Then she closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. "The original terms," she said. "The debt was for $2,000 at standard interest. The land is not mentioned as collateral anywhere in this document. The deed Donahue brought had land transfer language built into the original terms, but it is not here. It was added afterward." Her voice was very controlled and very cold. "He falsified the terms. This proves it." Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's forgery," he said. "Yes," she said. "We need to get that to Wichita today," he said, "to the deputy. And we need to send the telegraph to the federal land office that the deputy mentioned. If I leave this ranch today," she said, "I leave it unattended, and Donahue has men who have been watching this property for weeks. I know it. I have seen tracks near the south fence more than once." She looked at him with that clear, terrible steadiness. "I cannot leave. If I leave, I come back to a signed deed and a story about how I agreed to everything, and there will be people willing to swear to it." Walter thought for a moment. "Then I'll ride," he said. "Give me the original loan agreement. I'll carry it to Wichita, and I'll come back with the deputy and enough official weight to stop Thursday from happening." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. He gave it to her honestly. "Because what you wrote was true. Someone who still has good in them needed to find that note." He paused. "And I am very tired of being someone who doesn't act when action is needed." She held his gaze for a moment, reading him with those sharp, dark eyes, and he had the peculiar sensation of being seen clearly by someone for the first time in a long while. She folded the original loan document carefully and held it out to him. "Bring it back," she said. "That is my father's signature. That is all I have left of his honesty." "I will bring it back," Walter said. He took the document, tucked it inside his coat, untied Copper from the porch rail, and pointed the horse north toward Wichita for the second time in 12 hours. While Walter rode north, Marcella sat at her kitchen table and looked at the deputy's written statement and thought about the man who had brought it to her. She had not expected him. She had not expected anyone to be honest. She had put the note in the fence post the way you throw a message into a river, as a last, desperate hope that was more prayer than plan, and she had made her peace with the probability that no one would find it in time, or that whoever found it would fold it back up and ride on, because other people's trouble is heavy, and her situation had the particular weight of a woman alone against a man with money and influence. Walter Wilcox had not ridden on. He had ridden through the night to answer her. She turned this over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it. He was a ranch hand at the Keller property, which was not the same as being nobody. Elias Keller was a decent man, and he did not hire indecent ones, generally speaking. But it was not the same as being somebody established and known, either. Walter Wilcox was a man she could not fully account for. She did not know where he had come from or what he had done before Caldwell County. And yet, he had read her note and ridden 50 miles through the night, and stood at her door in the morning with honest exhaustion on his face and something in his eyes that she had not known how to name immediately. Something quiet and determined that was not pity and was not performance, and that she had eventually settled on calling integrity, for lack of a better word. She was not naive about men. 26 years of life and 9 months of Donahue's focused campaign against her had cured her permanently of any tendency toward naivety. She knew that men could perform kindness while harboring hidden motives, knew it in her bones. She knew that a woman alone with a valuable piece of property was a target for a particular kind of predatory interest dressed up as helpfulness. But she did not think that was what Walter Wilcox was. She thought about his face when she had asked him why. The way he had paused and answered honestly instead of smoothly. The way he had said, "I am very tired of being someone who doesn't act when action is needed," which was not the speech of a man performing heroism, but the speech of a man telling you something true about himself that he had not intended to say quite so plainly. She got up from the table and put more wood on the fire and went about the morning work of the ranch, feeding the horses, checking on the small herd, noting that the creek was running clear and cold, because the work did not stop for crisis, and she had learned long ago that doing the work was the best way to keep fear from taking over the whole of your mind. She thought about Thursday. She thought about Walter Wilcox riding north with her father's signature in his coat. Walter arrived in Wichita at mid-afternoon, copper-lathered and tired and well past deserving a rest, and went directly to the deputy's office. Crispin Aldous was behind the desk when he came in and looked up with the controlled surprise of a young man who had not expected to see the same stranger twice in 24 hours. Walter set the original loan document on the desk. "The original terms," he said. "Thomas Sawyer's signature, Donahue's signature, dated 1880. No land transfer clause. The deed Donahue brought to the Sawyer woman has been falsified. This proves the forgery." Crispin picked up the document and read it with the careful attention of someone who understood its significance. "This is legitimate," he said after a moment. "I can see the difference in the hand. The falsified deed will have the addition written in or will have been recopied with the new language." He looked up. "You need to file this at the county clerk's office as well. A formal dispute on record." "We have a problem with the county clerk," Walter said. "Donahue's man." "So she believes." Crispin was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he opened a drawer and removed paper. "I'm going to draft a formal complaint to the Federal Land Office in Topeka based on this document. I'm going to send it by telegraph today, fastest I can. And I'm going to ride to the Broken Spur tomorrow morning with you, officially, so that there is law present when Donahue arrives Thursday." "Thank you," Walter said. "I want you to understand something," Crispin said, setting down his pen and looking at Walter directly. "Gerald Donahue has not been arrested before because every time someone has tried to move against him, the evidence has disappeared or the witnesses have recanted or the judge has found a procedural reason to dismiss. This document is strong, but it is not automatically safe. It needs to be in multiple hands." Walter understood. He borrowed paper from the deputy and spent an hour writing out a full, detailed account of everything. How he had found the note, what the note said, his ride to Wichita, the deputy's written statement, the return to the Broken Spur, the discovery of the tin box, the original loan document's contents, and the specific ways in which the falsified deed differed from the original terms. He wrote it carefully and signed it. He left one copy with the deputy and kept one copy himself. Then he sent a telegraph to the Federal Land Office in Topeka, at the deputy's direction, with a brief summary of the forgery complaint. By 4 in the afternoon he was back on Copper, the original loan document and his own written account both tucked carefully inside his coat, and he was riding south again. He stopped at the Keller Ranch briefly to explain his absence to Elias Keller and to collect some food, because he had now gone approximately 20 hours on a cold biscuit and was beginning to feel it. Elias Keller was a direct man, and Walter gave him a direct account. Elias listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Donahue has been circling that property since Thomas died. I told Thomas not to borrow from him. Thomas did it anyway because he was proud and he didn't want it known he was struggling." He paused. "She's a good woman, Walter. Her father's daughter, you did right." Walter nodded and took the food Elias' wife pressed on him and went back to Copper. He arrived at the broken spur as the sun was touching the horizon, the sky going deep orange and pink behind the low flat line of the Kansas plain. The smoke from the chimney was heavier now, dinner being made, and the bay horse was in the corral. He rode up and knocked on the door again. This time she opened it faster. She looked at him in the golden light, this woman with her dark eyes and her rigid composure and the exhaustion that lived just underneath both of them. And then she looked at what he held out. The original document returned. She took it from him and something crossed her face that was not quite tears and was not quite relief but was the threshold between the two. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he replied. She stepped back from the door in invitation. "You must be starving," she said. "Come in." He came in. They ate at the kitchen table, the two of them, and it was the first time Walter had sat at a table with someone in months, rather than eating at the bunkhouse with other ranch hands. And there was a particular intimacy in that too, in the smallness of the kitchen and the lamplight and the dinner she had made. Something simple, a beef stew, but hot and good and generous in the way that frontier cooking is when someone is making it for another person they feel they owe something to. They talked while they ate. Not about Donahue at first. About the ranch, because she wanted to think about something else and she could talk about the broken spur with the specific, detailed love of someone for whom a place is not just land, but a whole history of love and grief and labor. She told him about the creek, how it froze in January, and her father would cut ice blocks from it to store in the ice house for summer. She told him about the eastern pasture, which had a gentle slope that was perfect for the cattle to shelter on in the worst of the winter wind. She told him about the way the light came through the kitchen window in the early morning, exactly the way it had come through when her mother was alive, and how she found it comforting for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate. Walter listened. He was good at listening, better than he was at talking, and he found that what she said was worth listening to, that she had a particular precision of observation and expression that made even ordinary things feel vivid and worth attending to. He told her when she asked that he had grown up in Missouri and had been moving through Kansas working country for the past 3 years. He told her about the failed homestead in Nebraska with a self-deprecating brevity that made her laugh once, a brief surprised laugh, before she caught herself. He did not tell her about the period in his early 20s that still woke him at 2 in the morning. That was not a dinner conversation. That was not a conversation at all if he could help it. But he felt the not telling as a small dishonesty and noted it. After dinner, she showed him the document again, both of them standing at the table, and she pointed out the specific language in the original that was absent from what Donahue had presented. And he could see clearly the architecture of the fraud, the careful way the forgery had been constructed to look like a legitimate contract, when it was in fact a trap that had been built over 2 years with her father's name as the foundation. "He planned this from before my father died," she said quietly. "He extended the loan knowing my father's health was failing. He intended this from the beginning." The anger in her voice was cold and clean, and Walter felt it matched something in himself. "Deputy is coming tomorrow," he said. "He'll be here before Donahue's Thursday deadline, and the Federal Land Office has been notified." "And if Donahue comes before the deputy?" she asked. "Then I'll be here," Walter said. She looked at him. "You do not have to do that," she said. "This is not your trouble. I made it my trouble when I pulled your note out of that fence post, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Why did you stop? She asked. At the fence post. Why did you look at it? He thought about this honestly. The paper was white against the dark wood, he said, and the wind was moving it. It caught my eye. A small thing, she said. Most things are, he said. Until they aren't. She looked away toward the window and the dark Kansas night outside. I do not know how to thank you properly, she said. I wrote that note because I had nothing left to try. I did not think anyone would come. You wrote it because you refused to simply let it happen, he said. That matters more than the note. She turned back to look at him, and there was something different in her expression now. Something softer under the exhaustion and the fear. Something that recognized itself in what he had said. She made up a place for him to sleep in the barn, a practical kindness given the distance back to the Keller ranch, and the impossibility of him riding away and leaving her alone for the night. And he slept in the hayloft with his coat and a blanket she brought him, and the horses moved quietly below him. And for the first time in 2 days he slept deeply, and without the 2 in the morning visitors that usually plagued him. He woke before dawn and was outside working, checking the fence line on the western edge of the property where she had mentioned seeing tracks, and he found them, boot prints and horse prints, and the particular flattened grass of someone who had been standing in one place watching the house for a long time. It made the back of his neck cold. Marcella was up and about by the time the sun rose, and she brought him coffee at the fence line without being asked, which struck him as the gesture of someone who was used to taking care of the work alongside whoever was doing it rather than waiting to be served. There were watchers here, he told her. 2, maybe 3 nights ago. She nodded. I thought so. He will want to know you're not alone, Walter said. Good, she said. They worked the ranch through the morning, she and Walter, and it was something he found he was not accustomed to, working alongside a woman who knew her land as well as he knew his own limitations, who could assess a fence line or a sick cow with the same quick competence she brought to everything else. There was nothing performed about her capability. It was simply who she was, built in, as natural as the way she walked. He found himself watching her more than was strictly necessary for any practical purpose. Crispin Aldous arrived at noon, riding a government horse and carrying a leather satchel. He shook Walter's hand and introduced himself properly to Marcella and laid out everything he had done. The telegraph to Topeka was confirmed received. The formal complaint was on record at his office, and he had with him a document from Sheriff Hannigan, who had roused himself from his sickbed long enough to sign it, declaring the Broken Spur property under formal legal dispute pending federal review. If Donahue presents that deed tomorrow and asks you to sign, Crispin told Marcella, you present this document. It renders any signature coerced under existing dispute conditions legally invalid. He cannot force a clean transaction with this hanging over it. Marcella read the document carefully. Does he know about the original loan papers? She asked. He will when he arrives, Crispin said. I intend to present the comparison myself. He won't come alone, Walter said. No, Crispin agreed. He won't, which is why I sent word to Elias Keller and 2 other ranchers in the county whose land borders the Broken Spur and who have their own interests in seeing Donahue checked. They'll be here Thursday morning. Marcella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you did all of that. He did most of it, Crispin said, nodding toward Walter. She looked at Walter. He looked at the ground. Wednesday passed in the particular charged stillness of a day before something unavoidable. Crispin stayed at the ranch, sleeping in the barn with Walter, and the 3 of them went about the work of the day with the awareness of Thursday sitting just ahead of them like weather you could see coming from 50 miles off. That evening, Marcella made a bigger dinner, enough for 3, and they ate together at the table and talked, genuinely talked, the way people do when they are waiting for something and the waiting demands to be filled with something real. Crispin Aldous turned out to be from a farm family in eastern Kansas, the son of German immigrant parents, who had taken up law work because he believed, with the earnest conviction of youth that the law could be made to work for people who needed it rather than against them. Walter found himself liking the young deputy considerably. And Marcella, who had been careful and guarded since the first moment, began to relax by increments in the warmth of the lamp and the conversation. And the person underneath, the rigid competence, started to emerge, dryly funny, unexpectedly warm, fiercely intelligent in a way that had clearly been largely unwelcome to the people around her for most of her life. After Crispin went to the barn and they were left alone in the kitchen for the last few minutes of the evening, Marcella and Walter stood at opposite ends of the table and looked at each other in the lamplight. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know that what you did, finding that note and acting on it, it was not nothing. Whatever happens, it was not nothing." "I know what happens tomorrow," Walter said. "You keep your ranch." She smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the brief surprised laugh from dinner the night before, but a real smile, and it changed her face into something he had not been prepared for. He slept badly that night, but not because of the 2 in the morning visitors. It was a different kind of wakefulness entirely. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, a front coming in from the northwest that put a thin edge of ice on the water trough and made the horses restless. Elias Keller arrived at 8 with 2 neighboring ranchers, brothers named Cobb, whose land sat east and south of the broken spur, and who had their own long-standing grievances with Donahue's land acquisition methods. By 9 o'clock there were 6 people on the porch of the broken spur ranch house: Marcella, Walter, Crispin, Elias, and the 2 Cobb brothers, and there was hot coffee and a visible and united front that the approaching horsemen could have seen from a quarter-mile. Gerald Donahue arrived at 9:30 with 4 men, 3 of them carrying the particular posture of hired intimidation, and one who turned out to be his lawyer from Wichita, a thin, pale man who looked deeply unhappy to be outdoors in October. Donahue was exactly as Walter had pictured him from Marcella's description: large, prosperous-looking, with fine wool and careful grooming and the kind of confident ease that comes from having consistently gotten what he wanted. He slowed his horse when he saw the crowd on the porch. His confident ease developed a slightly different texture. He rode up to the gate and dismounted with studied casualness. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "I see you've assembled quite the audience." "Mr. Donahue," Crispin Aldous said, stepping forward, "I am Deputy Sheriff Crispin Aldous of Sedgwick County. I am here in an official capacity." Donahue's eyes moved over Crispin with the assessment of a man who has learned to gauge threats quickly. "Deputy," he said, "this is a private business matter." "It was," Crispin said. "It is now a matter of official record. A formal complaint has been filed with this office and with the Federal Land Office in Topeka regarding the document you presented to Miss Sawyer last week." He opened his satchel and removed the original loan agreement. "We have the original loan agreement signed by yourself and Thomas Sawyer in 1880. The land transfer clause present in the deed you brought is not present in the original. That constitutes fraud and forgery under federal statute." Donahue's composure did not fully break. It was too practiced for that, but Walter watched the calculations happening behind his eyes. "I am sure there has been a clerical misunderstanding," Donahue said smoothly, looking at his lawyer. "There was no misunderstanding," Marcella said. She stepped forward and her voice was absolutely steady. "You came to this house and you put a pen in front of me and told me to choose between a marriage I did not want and a deed transfer that was based on a document you falsified. I have the original agreement. You do not own this land. You never will." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room, or in this case a porch, recognizes the precise moment a balance shifts. Donahue looked at the assembled ranchers, at Elias Keller's steady gaze, and the Cobb brothers' crossed arms, at Crispin holding the original document, at Walter standing slightly behind and to the right of Marcella in a position that was not accidental, and something in his face settled into a different expression entirely. His lawyer leaned close to him and spoke quietly. Donahue listened. He looked once more at the document in Crispin's hand. "Any review process will take considerable time," he said finally, attempting to recover some ground. "The federal land office will be in Caldwell County within the week," Crispin said. "At that point, any attempt to pressure this property or its owner in any form will be considered obstruction of federal proceedings." The lawyer spoke close to Donahue's ear again. Donahue straightened his coat. He looked at Marcella with an expression that was not quite rage and not quite humiliation but contained both. "We will let the legal process proceed," he said. He turned his horse and rode away, his men following, and his lawyer, with the air of a man who had expected to spend this morning indoors, followed last. The ranchers on the porch watched them go. Elias Keller released a long breath. One of the Cobb brothers said something short and profane that expressed the general sentiment. Marcella stood very still until the riders had passed the gate and were moving north along the road. Then she sat down on the top porch step and put her face in her hands for a moment, just a moment, and the composure that she had been maintaining for 9 months cracked just enough to let through whatever was underneath it. Walter sat down beside her on the step. He did not say anything. He did not need to. After a moment she lifted her face from her hands and looked out at her land, the creek line and the flat golden grassland and the thin cold sky, all of it still hers, still exactly as it had been when her father built it. "Thank you," she said quietly. She said it to the general air, to the assembled people, to whatever Grace had arranged for a ranch hand on his way home to glance at a fence post in October. But she turned and looked at Walter when she said it, and the look was specific. "Your note did the work," he said. "I just delivered it." The legal proceeding moved with more speed than Marcella had dared hope, largely because the federal land office in Topeka was already aware of Donahue's activity and had been building a case for over a year. Marcella's complaint and the original loan document were the specific solid evidence they needed to move. 2 weeks after Thursday morning, federal agents arrived in Caldwell County, and Gerald Donahue was formally charged with fraud, forgery, and coercion in connection with multiple land transactions, of which the broken spur was only one. The county clerk who had been in Donahue's pocket resigned and was replaced. The deed Donahue had presented was ruled fraudulent. Marcella Sawyer's ownership of the broken spur was confirmed and documented without question. Sheriff Hannigan, fully recovered from his fever, called on Marcella personally to offer the county's formal apology for the circumstances that had allowed Donahue's activities to go unchecked for so long. She received it with the same clear-eyed dignity with which she seemed to receive everything. Walter had returned to the Keller ranch after Thursday because the work was there and because he was a man who had learned the value of not overstepping. He did not call on Marcella in the days immediately following, though he thought about doing it. He thought about it more than he was entirely comfortable with. It was Elias Keller who, about a week after Thursday, looked up from a fence post he was hammering and said, without particular preamble, "Miss Sawyer asked after you." Walter kept hammering. "Did she?" he said. "Said she'd like to thank you properly when you had the time," Elias said. "Suggested Sunday afternoon." Walter drove a nail in with more force than the post required. "I might have time Sunday," he said. Elias did not say anything more. He was a wise man. Walter arrived at the broken spur on Sunday afternoon with a self-consciousness that he had not experienced in years. His best shirt, his hair combed, his hat in his hand rather than on his head as he knocked on the door, which was the particular combination of formal effort and underlying nervousness that characterized a man who was not used to wanting to make a good impression. Marcella opened the door and looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in what might have been amusement. "Your horse is better dressed than mine," she said. He looked back at Copper and then at her, confused. "I'm joking," she said. "Come in." She had made coffee and a kind of apple cake that she said was her mother's recipe, produced from whatever apples had come from the small tree at the side of the house, and they sat at the kitchen table in the Sunday afternoon light and talked. They talked differently than they had in the crisis days, when every conversation had been shaped by urgency and purpose. They talk the way you talk when you are getting to know someone specifically because you want to, which is a different thing entirely. She asked him about Missouri, and this time he told her more. He told her about his family, the four brothers and the hard-drinking father and the mother who had managed to be quietly loving in the middle of a difficult household, who had died when Walter was 20, and whose death had coincided with the period he did not like to think about. He told her about that period too, not every detail but the shape of it, a time when he had run with men whose methods he had known were wrong and had gone along with anyway because he was young and angry and had not yet understood that going along with wrong things made you wrong too. He watched her face as he said this. She was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" she asked. "Specifically." "I helped rob 2 stagecoaches," he said, "and a general store. No one was killed, and I told myself that made it acceptable, and I was wrong about that." He paused. "I turned myself in at 22. I served 18 months. I have been trying since I got out to be a different kind of man." The kitchen was quiet. "That is a significant thing to tell a woman you barely know," Marcella said. "You trusted me with your father's signature," he said. "It seemed only fair." She looked at him for a long time with those dark, reading eyes. "The man who rode through the night for a stranger's note," she said slowly, "and the man who robbed stagecoaches. Both of those are you." "Yes," he said. "Both of those are me. I think the distance between those 2 men matters," she said, "and I think most people never travel it." He looked at her. "I am not interested in who you were," she said. "I am interested in who you are." Something in him that had been braced for a long time came slightly undone. He visited again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. And somewhere in the third Sunday's conversation, which had extended from the afternoon into the evening and then into a lamplit kitchen over dinner, she reached across the table and put her hand over his where it rested beside his coffee cup, a brief touch, deliberate and clear, and his heart did something large and ungainly in his chest. "I want to ask you something," she said, withdrawing her hand with a composure he envied. "Ask," he said. "When Donahue's situation is fully resolved," she said, "when the federal proceedings are finished and the land is secure and there is no more crisis requiring assistance, will you still come on Sunday afternoons?" He looked at her directly. "I have been trying to find a reason to come that wasn't the crisis," he said, "for about 2 Sundays now." She smiled, and it was the smile that changed her face, and he thought he would ride 50 miles through any night in creation to see it. "Then come," she said. November moved toward December, and the federal proceedings against Donahue progressed with the slow but steady grind of federal law, and Walter Wilcox continued to come to the Broken Spur on Sunday afternoons, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings too, because Marcella had a way of mentioning in passing that there was a fence section on the northwest corner that needed a second person to reset the posts, and he had a way of arriving with tools on Wednesday morning. They worked side by side through those fall weeks and learned each other in the way that work teaches you people more thoroughly than conversation does, what someone is patient with and what they are not, how they handle frustration, what makes them laugh, when they need to be quiet. He learned that she had a habit of humming very softly when she was thinking hard, not a recognizable tune, just a kind of low musical murmur that she was entirely unaware of. She learned that he had the particular quality of not talking when there was nothing useful to say, which she found restful beyond all description given the months she had spent surrounded by people whose words were all either threats or hollow reassurances. He told her more about Nebraska, about the 2 years trying to homestead, the isolation and the hope, and the specific kind of defeat that comes from working as hard as you possibly can and still failing, not through a lack of effort, but through a combination of drought and bad luck, and the fundamental precariousness of a single person trying to make a claim on frontier land alone. "You needed someone alongside you," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She did not say anything more to that. She didn't need to. In December, two things happened in close succession. The first was that Gerald Donahue, facing the full weight of the federal fraud charges and the dissolution of his land acquisition scheme, entered a guilty plea in federal court and was sentenced to 8 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. The county land records were fully reviewed, and 3 other properties whose deeds had been falsified under Donahue's scheme were returned to their rightful owners. The second thing was that Walter Wilcox, on a Wednesday evening in mid-December when the first real winter had arrived, and the kitchen was warm with the fire and Marcella had made a pot of the beef stew that he had thought about more than once since the first time she made it, said to her across the table, "I have been thinking about whether to ask you to walk out with me formally, as a couple, and I realize I have been thinking about whether to ask instead of simply asking for too long." She set down her fork. "You are asking me now," she said. "I am asking you now." She was quiet for a moment in the way that she was quiet when she was thinking, not uncertain but deliberate. He had learned to wait out her silences without filling them. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He exhaled. "Good," he said. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it." "You stay," she said. "Not just on Sundays and Wednesdays, eventually. I mean, the ranch needs someone who is actually here, and I have been running it alone for a year, and I am very capable of continuing to do so, but I would prefer not to if the alternative is someone I actually want here." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am not in a position to stay yet," he said honestly. "I have obligations to Elias through the end of the season, and I won't walk away from a commitment. But when the season ends—" "When the season ends," she agreed. The winter of 1882 was hard in Kansas, as winters in Kansas tended to be, but the Broken Spur weathered it in better condition than the previous year, because Marcella had planned carefully, and because she had, by the time January arrived, a partner in the planning, a man who could see water sources and herd management and winter feed supply with a working rancher's eye, and who discussed it with her as an equal rather than as someone to be told what to do. Walter moved to the Broken Spur in January, after the Keller seasonal work was concluded, taking the small bedroom off the kitchen that had been used for storage, and that Marcella cleared out for him with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had been waiting to do it for some time. He slept in that room and worked the ranch alongside her by day and sat at the kitchen table with her in the evenings, and the rhythm of it, the daily specific intimacy of a shared life and shared work, deepened between them into something that had the particular solidity of a thing built slowly and well. He kissed her for the first time on a January evening when they were coming in from checking on the cattle in the east pasture, and a snow squall had come through while they were out, and the world was white and stinging, and they had come into the barn laughing at the unexpected cold, both of them dusted with snow, and she had turned to say something, and he had kissed her instead. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything else. "I have been waiting for that for approximately 2 months, she said when they broke apart. "Only 2 months, he said. She laughed, the full, warm laugh he had been accumulating every instance of like something precious. February was cold and quiet and good. They worked and talked and grew into each other's habits with the ease of two people who had each been shaped by solitude and independence, and found in the other someone who did not ask them to be less than they were, but simply wanted to be alongside them while they were it. Walter told her the full story of the robbery period one cold February night, not just the outline but the details, the specific men he had run with, what he had felt, what he had been running from, the moment he had walked into the county sheriff's office and turned himself in, and why, which was a moment that still felt important to him, not as absolution, but as evidence of a choice he had made when he could have made the other one. She listened to all of it. She asked questions that were specific and thoughtful and free of judgment. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The thing about a dark past," she said, "is that it is only disqualifying if you let it be the whole story. And you have not let it be." "I try not to," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see you trying every day." He looked at the fire. "That means something to me," he said, "that you can see it." "I am very observant," she said with a small smile. "You are," he agreed. March brought the first warmth and the first real green on the Kansas plain and the creek running high and clear with snowmelt. The broken spur was in good condition, the cattle healthy, the fence lines solid, the finances, with the forgery scheme behind them, steadier than they had been in 2 years. Walter proposed to Marcella on a March morning when they were standing at the fence post where he had found her note, which was a choice on his part that was not accidental. He had ridden out there the evening before to think about it, and the rightness of it as a place had been immediate and certain. He showed her the fence post. "This is where it started," he said. She looked at the fence post and then at him, and her face was very still. "For you," she said. "For me," he agreed. "For you it started in the middle of the night at a kitchen table when you were trying to find a way out of a trap. I am glad you found one." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that this is not gratitude, and it is not pity, and it is not any version of trying to take something from you. The broken spur is yours. It was your father's, and it is yours. I do not want a single acre of it as anything other than the land my wife's family built." Her eyes were bright. "That is a very particular way of proposing," she said. "I wanted to be clear," he said. "You have been clear," she said. "You have been clear since the morning you knocked on my door with papers from the sheriff's office and the look of a man who has not slept in 30 hours. You were very clear." "Then will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Walter, yes." They married in April in the church in town. A simple ceremony with Crispin Aldous and Elias Keller and Elias' wife present, and the Cobb brothers, who had developed a warm regard for Marcella through the Donahue proceedings, and who showed up in their Sunday best with wildflowers they had picked along the road, which made Marcella cry briefly and quietly in a way that she then denied having done. Crispin Aldous, who had turned 21 in March and was clearly deeply moved by being asked to witness the wedding of two people he had a small but genuine hand in bringing together, gave a toast at the small dinner afterward that managed to be sincere and slightly awkward, and entirely charming all at once, expressing the general hope that the broken spur would be the kind of place where notes tucked in fence posts led to more good things in the future. Walter put his arm around Marcella's shoulders while Crispin spoke, and she leaned into him slightly. Not in dependence, but in choice. The specific lean of someone who has decided where they want to stand. And he felt the weight and the warmth of it, and thought about how a person could spend their entire life moving, and then stop, and know that they had stopped in the right place. They danced after dinner. The four couples arranged in Elias Keller's front room with the furniture pushed back and Elias' wife playing a fiddle with considerable skill. And Walter Wilcox, who had not danced in years and was not what anyone would call graceful, made Marcella laugh 3 times trying to remember the steps of a simple waltz. And the 4th time he got it right, and she stopped laughing and looked at him with something so open and warm in her face that he momentarily forgot what his feet were supposed to be doing. Summer came to the broken spur, and it was the kind of summer that a ranch needed after 2 years of crisis and loss, hot and golden and productive. The cattle herd growing, the creek running, the fence lines holding. Walter and Marcella worked the land together with the specific fluency of 2 people who had learned each other thoroughly and trusted each other completely. And the trust was not naive. It was the kind that had been built through difficulty and survived it. She told him in July, standing at the kitchen table in the evening with a directness that he had come to understand, was simply how she delivered every important piece of information, that she was expecting a child. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his and looked at her face and said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "I am well," she said. "I am somewhat frightened. I am also very happy." She paused. "Are you?" "Marcella," he said, "I found your note in a fence post in October, and it rearranged my whole life. A child with you is the next sentence in the best thing that has ever happened to me." She put her forehead against his shoulder and held on. The child came in late February. A boy, born in the ranch house with the help of the town doctor and Elias Keller's wife, and he arrived in the world with the particular determined loudness of someone who intended to make his presence known. They named him Thomas Walter Wilcox, for Marcella's father, and for his own, in that order, because Marcella said that the name of the man who built the broken spur should come first, and Walter agreed without hesitation because it was exactly right. Thomas Walter Wilcox was a large-lunged, serious-faced baby who looked, in Walter's opinion, entirely like his mother, and in Marcella's opinion, like no one except himself. He slept poorly and fed well, and seemed from the first weeks of his life to have a highly developed opinion about everything. Marcella took to motherhood with the same competent directness she brought to everything, but Walter saw in her private moments with the baby, in the early morning when she would sit by the fire nursing him, and he would come quietly into the kitchen and find them there, a tenderness that was the softest thing in the world, and that moved him every single time. He began to understand in those months something about his own life that he had not understood before, that the things that seemed like accidents, the fence post, the angle of the October light, the white paper in the corner of his eye, were not really accidents. They were the moments where who you were and what you chose intersected, and the result was the only kind of life that was truly yours. The summer Thomas was 2, a second child arrived, a girl this time, dark-eyed and alert from her first hours in the world, and they named her Clara for Marcella's mother, and she grew up to have her mother's particular quality of reading a room and her father's tendency to help before being asked. And between the two of them, Thomas with his determined seriousness and Clara with her sharp warmth, the broken spur became the kind of house that a person could feel from the road. Crispin Aldous, who had by then been made full sheriff of the county when Hannigan retired in '85, came to dinner at the broken spur 2 or 3 times a year, and was adopted by the Wilcox children as an unofficial uncle, a role he accepted with the same earnest dedication he brought to everything else. He never mentioned the night Walter had arrived at the office gray with exhaustion and urgency, without something warm moving across his face, because he knew, better than most, that the particular chain of small choices that had led to all of them sitting around Marcella's kitchen table began with a man who had been tired enough to stop at a fence post. The broken spur grew in the years that followed, not dramatically, not through aggressive expansion of the kind Donahue had practiced, but steadily, the way healthy things grow, a few acres added when neighboring land came available through honest transaction, the herd improving through careful breeding, the ranch house expanded by Walter's own labor over a winter project that added a proper parlor and 2 more bedrooms for the children who filled them. Marcella Wilcox ran the books with the same precise hand that had written the note in October of '82, and the broken spurs ledgers were clean and balanced, and showed a ranch that was not rich but was profoundly solvent, built on honest work and clear accounting, and the particular advantage of owning land that sat on a reliable water source in country where water was life. She and Walter argued occasionally, as people who work closely together and care deeply about what they work on inevitably do, with the particular sharpness of 2 people who are both used to being competent and right. Their arguments were short and direct, and usually resolved the same day, because neither of them had any patience for prolonged grievance, and because underneath the friction was always the bedrock certainty that they were on the same side. He told her once, after an argument about the best approach to a section of the herd that needed culling, an argument that he had in fact been wrong about and acknowledged as such, that he did not know how to fight with her without finding himself on her side by the end of it. "That is because I am usually right," she said. "That is often true," he said, and she threw a kitchen towel at him and they both laughed, and Thomas, who was 4 and watching from the doorway, asked with great seriousness whether fighting and laughing were the same thing, and Walter and Marcella looked at each other over the child's head and said together, "Sometimes." The years passed the way years pass in the proper life of a place, visibly in the growth of the children and invisibly in the deepening of everything that mattered. Walter's dark past remained his past, known to Marcella and to no one else who needed to know it, and he carried it not as a secret that controlled him, but as a history that had made him specifically the man who had stopped at that fence post, which was the man he had chosen to be and would choose again. In the summer of 1890, when Thomas was 8 and Clara was 6, and Marcella was standing in the kitchen in the evening with the lamp lit, and the children finishing their supper and the sound of the creak through the open window, Walter came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene, his wife and his children in the warm circle of the lamplight, his ranch and his home and his life, arranged around him with the rightness of things that have been built honestly from the ground up, and he thought, "This is the answer. This is what the fence post was asking." Marcella looked up from the stove and saw him standing there. "Are you going to stand in the doorway all evening?" she said. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" He came into the kitchen and kissed her, which made Thomas groan with theatrical disgust and Clara watch with the deep interested approval of a 6-year-old who has decided that her parents are generally doing things correctly. "About the note," he said. She went still for a moment, the way she sometimes did when he mentioned it. "You still think about it," she said. It was not quite a question. "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't been riding that way," he said. "If the angle of the light had been different, if the wind hadn't been moving the paper." "Someone else would have found it," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe not," she said quietly. "And then I would have had to find another way." "Would you have," he asked, "found another way?" She looked at him with those dark, reading eyes. "I would have tried," she said. "I always try." "I know," he said. "But I am very glad it was you who found it," she said. He took her hand at the kitchen counter, the way you take someone's hand when you don't need to say the thing because the holding is the thing, and she turned back to the stove with their fingers still loosely linked, and the children finished their supper, and outside the window the Kansas night came on slowly, the sky going deep and purple and scattered with stars over the flat horizon, over the grassland and the creek and the fence line that ran along the edge of the property where an old cedar post still stood, weathered now and leaning slightly, its hollow, long empty of the note that had started everything. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Marcella sat at the kitchen table with her ledger books as she did most evenings, and Walter sat across from her with a cup of coffee and a quiet that was not empty but full, the specific fullness of a life that had been gathered carefully over years. "I need to tell you something," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "All right," he said. She did look up then. "Another child," she said. He set down his coffee cup. She watched him with those eyes. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and said, "You are well. You are happy." "I am both," she said. "Are you?" "Marcella," he said, "every time you tell me this I am." She smiled, and it was the smile from the first Thursday, the one that had changed her face the first time he saw it properly, and 8 years had not made him any more prepared for it than the first time. He thought about October of 1882, the angle of the light and the white paper and the wind, and the note that had rearranged the coordinates of his entire life, and he thought, a man spends years moving, and then he stops. He had stopped exactly where he was supposed to. The third child was born the following spring, another boy, dark-haired and loud like his brother had been, and they named him James Crispin Wilcox, the second name for the young deputy who had done what law was supposed to do when it was doing it right, and Crispin Aldous, who arrived at the Broken Spur to meet his namesake with his hat in his hand and a complicated expression, looked at the baby, and then at Walter and Marcella and said, with the sincerity that had always been his most endearing quality, that he was very glad a man named Walter Wilcox had once found a note in a fence post and had the good sense to ride on it. Marcella, who was sitting up in bed with the new baby and had heard this speech from the doorway, said, "So is he," and looked at Walter across the room with the particular look that was theirs alone, A look that had been built out of October urgency and winter work and January kisses in the barn and 8 years of choosing each other every day. And Walter looked back at her the same way. And the ranch settled around them in the late spring afternoon, the children and the creek and the clean Kansas sky. All of it as solid and real as the cedar fence post at the property line, as permanent as the choice that had made all of it possible. He had found her note. He had ridden through the night to answer it, and everything since had been the answer continuing, unfolding, deepening, becoming exactly the life that was meant to be lived in this place, by these two people, built from a single folded square of paper, and a man with enough good left in him to stop,